Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Tonight is what is it, the 14th? Nope, not quite. Is it the 14th? I guess it is the 14th day of September, 2024. Let me check here real quick. I think it is. No, it's actually September 12th. Okay, 2 days ahead. So I'm going to be reading again a chapter of the book called The Invisible Rainbow. Irritable Heart is the name of the chapter, chapter 11, by author Firstenberg. So thank you for being here, and we're going to get into the reading here tonight. On the first day of autumn 1998, Florence Griffith Joyner, former Olympic track gold medalist, died in her sleep at the age of 38 when her heart stopped beating. That same fall, Canadian ice hockey player Stéphane Morin, aged 29, died of a sudden heart failure during a hockey game in Germany, leaving behind a wife and a newborn son. Chad Silver, who had played on the Swiss national ice hockey team, also aged 29, died of a heart attack. Former Tampa Bay Buccaneer nose tackle Dave Logan collapsed and died from the same cause. He was 42. None of these athletes had any history of heart disease. A decade later, responding to mounting alarm among the sports community, the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation created a national registry of sudden deaths in athletes. After combing through public records, news reports, hospital archives, and autopsy records, the foundation inherited over 1,049 American athletes in 38 competitive sports who had suffered sudden cardiac arrests between 1980 and 2006. The data confirmed what the sports community already knew. In 1980, heart attacks in young athletes were rare. Only 9 cases occurred in the United States. The number rose gradually but steadily, increasing about 10% per year until 1996, when the number of cases of fatal cardiac arrest among athletes suddenly doubled. There were 64 that year, and 66 the following year, in the last year of the study. 76 competitive athletes died when their hearts gave out, most of them under 18 years of age. The American medical community was at a loss to explain it, but in Europe, some physicians thought they knew the answer, not only to the question of why so many young athletes' hearts could no longer stand the strain of exertion, but to the more general question of why so many young people were succumbing to diseases from which only old people used to die. On October 9, 2002, Association of German Doctors Specializing in Environmental Medicine began circulating a document calling for a moratorium on antennas and towers used for mobile phone communications. Electromagnetic radiation, they said, was causing a drastic rise in both acute and chronic diseases, prominent among which were, quote, extreme fluctuation in blood pressure, end quote. Also heart rhythm disorders, end quote, and, quote, heart attacks and strokes among an increasing younger population, end quote. 3,000 physicians signed this document, named the Freiburger Appeal after the German city in which it was drafted. Their analysis, if correct, could explain the sudden doubling of heart attacks among American athletes in 1996. That was the year digital cell phones first went on sale in the United States, and the year cell phone companies began building tens of thousands of cell towers to make them work. Although I knew about the Freiburger Appeal, or Freiburger, whichever you want to pronounce it, and the profound effects electricity could have on the heart, when I first conceived this book, I did not intend to include a chapter on heart disease, for I was still in denial despite the abundant evidence. We recalled from chapter 8 that Marconian, the father of radio, had 10 heart attacks after he began his world-changing work. including the one that killed him at the young age of 63. So this is Marconian. Tesla at one time got the award at one time in the United States as being the inventor of the radio, but that changed. And so Marconian was seen as the one who was the inventor of radio. Quote, anxiety disorder, end quote, which is rampant today and most often diagnosed from its cardiac symptoms. Many suffering from an acute, quote, anxiety attack, end quote, have heart palpitations, shortness of breath, and pain or pressure in the chest, which so often resembles an actual heart attack that hospital emergency rooms are visited by more patients who turn out to have nothing more than anxiety, end quote, than by patients who prove to have something wrong with their hearts. And yet we recall from chapter 6 that, quote, anxiety neurosis, end quote, was an invention of Sigmund Freud, a renaming of a disease formerly called neurasthenia that became prevalent only in the late 19th century following the building of the first electrical communication systems. Radio wave sickness, described by Russian doctors in the 1950s, included cardiac disturbances as a prominent feature. Not only did I know all this, but I myself had suffered for 35 years from palpitations, I should say, abnormal heart rhythm, shortness of breath, and chest pain related to exposure to electricity. Yet when my friend and colleague Jolie Andrzejewski suggested to me that heart disease itself had appeared in medical literature for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century, and that I should write a chapter about it. So there was no heart attack. There was no heart disease before this, folks. This is what he's saying. This is revelations, revolutionary and revelations to us. It has not always been like this. This is me explaining some things. I was taken by surprise. In medical school, I had had it so thoroughly drilled into me that cholesterol is the main cause of heart disease that I never before questioned the wisdom that bad diet and lack of exercise are the most important factors contributing to the modern epidemic. I had no doubt that the electromagnetic radiation could cause heart attacks, but I did not yet suspect that it was responsible for heart disease. Then another colleague, Dr. Samuel Milham, muddled the waters some more. Milham is an MD and an epidemiologist, retired from the Washington State Department of Health. He wrote an article in 2010 followed by a short book suggesting that the modern epidemics of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer are largely, if not entirely, caused by electricity. He included solid statistics to back up these assertions. I decided to dive in. I first became aware of Milham's work in 1996 when I was asked to help with a national lawsuit against the Federal Communication Commission. I was still living in Brooklyn, that is, and knew only that the telecommunication industry was promising, that is, a, quote, wireless revolution, end quote. The industry wanted to place a cell phone in the hands of every American, and in order to make these devices work in the urban canyons of my hometown, they were applying for permission to, quote, to erect thousands of microwave antennas close to street level throughout New York. Advertisements for the new FANG phones were beginning to appear on radio and television, telling the public why they needed such things and that they would make ideal Christmas gifts. I did not have any idea how radical the world was about to change. Then came a phone call from David Firstenberg, a statistician, I should say, in Washington State, who told me the FCC had just released human exposure guidelines for microwave radiation and asked if I wanted to join a nationwide legal challenge against them. The new guidelines, I came to find out, had been written by the cell phone industry itself and did not protect people from any of the effects of microwave radiation except one: being cooked like a roast in a microwave oven. None of the known effects of such radiation, apart from heat, effects on the heart. nervous system, thyroid gland, and other organs were taken into consideration. Worse, Congress had passed a law that January that actually made it illegal for cities and states to regulate this new technology on the basis of health. Are you aware of all this stuff? I'm learning here. This is really sad. This is really super sad. President Clinton has signed it on February 8th. In other words, they boondoggled this thing through. The industry, the FCC, the Congress, and the President were conspiring to tell us that we should all feel comfortable holding devices that emit microwave radiation directly against our brains, and that we should all get used to living in close quarters with microwave towers because they were coming to a street near you, whether you liked it or not. A giant biological experiment had been launched, and we were all going to be unwitting guinea pigs. Except that the outcome was already known. You see, the research had been done, and the scientists who had done it were trying to tell us what the new technology was going to do to the brains of cell phone users and to the hearts and nervous system of people living in the vicinity of cell towers. Yes, folks, you don't need to you need to move away from cell towers at best. Okay, which one day soon was going to be everybody. Samuel Milham Jr. was one of those researchers. He had not done any of the clinical or experimental research on individual humans or animals. Such work had been done by others in previous decades. Milham is an epidemiologist, a scientist who proves that the results attained by others in the laboratory actually happen to masses of people living in the real world. In his early studies, he has shown that electricians, power line workers, telephone linesmen, aluminum workers, radio and TV repairmen, welders, and amateur radio operators, those who work expose them to electricity or electromagnetic radiation, die far more often than the general public from leukemia, lymphoma, and brain tumors. He knew that the new FCC standards were inadequate, and he made himself available as a consultant to those who were challenging them in court. In recent years, Milham turned his skills to the examination of vital statistics from the 1930s and 1940s, when the Roosevelt administration made it a national priority to electrify every farm and rural community in America. What Milham discovered surprised even him. Not only cancer, he found, but also diabetes and heart disease seemed to be directly related to residential electrification. Rural communities that had no electricity had little heart disease until electric service began. In fact, in 1940, country folk in electrified regions of the country were suddenly dying of heart disease 4 to 5 times as frequently as those who still lived out of electricity's reach. It seems unbelievable that mortality differences of this magnitude could go unexplained for over 70 years after they were first reported, end quote, wrote Milham. He speculated that early in the 20th century, nobody was looking for answers. But when I began reading the early literature, I found that everyone was looking for answers. Paul Dudley White, for example, a well-known cardiologist associated with Harvard Medical School, puzzled over the problem in 1938. In the second edition of his textbook called Heart Disease, he wrote in amazement that Austin Flint, a prominent physician practicing internal medicine in New York City during the last half of the 19th century, had not encountered a single case of angina pectoris, that means chest pain due to heart disease, for one period of 5 years. White was provoked by the tripling of heart disease rates in his home state of Massachusetts since he had begun practicing in 1911, quote, as a cause of death, end quote. He wrote, quote, heart disease had assumed greater and greater proportions in this part of the world until now it leads all other cases, having far outstripped tuberculosis, pneumonia, and malignant diseases, end quote. In 1970, at the end of his career, White was still unable to say why this was so. All he could do was wonder at the fact that coronary heart disease due to clogged ordinary arteries that is, which is the most common type of heart disease today, had once been so rare that he has seen almost no cases in his first few years of practice. Quote, of the first 100 pages I published, end quote, he wrote, quote, only two at the end of the 100 were concerned with coronary heart disease, end quote. Heart disease had not, however, sprung full-blown from nothing at the turn of the 20th century. It had been relatively uncommon, but not unheard of. The vital statistics of the United States shows that rates of heart disease had begun to rise long before White graduated from medical school. The modern epidemic actually began quite suddenly in the 1870s, at the same time as the first great proliferation of telegraph wires. But that is to jump ahead of myself. For the evidence that heart disease is caused primarily by electricity is even more extensive than Milham suspected, and the mechanism by which electricity damages the heart is known. To begin with, we need not rely only on historical data for evidence supporting Milham's proposal, for electrification is still going on in a few parts of the world. From 1984 to 1987, scientists at the Silaram Bhattacharya Institute of Science and Research decided to compare rates of coronary heart disease in Delhi, India, which were disturbingly high, with rates in rural areas of Gurgaon district in Haryana state 50 to 70 kilometers away. 27,000 people were interviewed, and as expected, the researchers found more heart disease in the city than in the country. But they were surprised with the fact that virtually all of the supposed risk factors were actually greater in the rural districts. City dwellers, that is, they smoke much less. They consume fewer calories, less cholesterol, and much less saturated fat than their rural counterparts, yet they had 5 times as much heart disease. It is clear from the present study, end quote, wrote the researchers, quote, that the prevalence of coronary heart disease and its urban-rural differences are not related to any particular risk factor, and it is therefore necessary to look for other factors beyond the convenience, that is, the conventional explanation, end quote. The most obvious factor that these researchers did not look at was electricity. For in the mid-1980s, the Gurgaon district had not yet been electrified. In order to make sense of these kind of data, it is necessary to review what is known and what is still not known about heart disease, electricity, and the relationship between the two. My Hungarian grandmother, who was the main cook in my family while I was growing up, had arteriosclerosis, that is, hardening of the arteries. She fed us the same meals she cooked for herself, and at the advice of her doctor, they were low in fat. She happened to be a marvelous cook, so after I left home, I continued eating in a similar style because I was hooked on the taste. For the past 38 years, I have also been a vegetarian. I feel healthiest eating this way, and I believe that is good for my heart. However, soon after I began to do research for this chapter, a friend gave me a book to read titled, quote, Cholesterol Myths. This is key, folks. It was published in 2000 by Danish physician Ulf Rockenskjold, a specialist in internal medicine and kidney disease and retired family practice doctor living in Lund, L-U-N-D, Sweden. I resisted reading it because Roscoe is not unbiased. He thinks vegetarians are pleasure-avoiding stoics who heroically deny themselves the taste of proper foods in the mistaken belief that this will make them live longer. Yeah, the doctor, the guys talking last night was talking about this issue. People who actually, quote unquote, who are living a vegan lifestyle are actually worse shape than those who are eating meat. That's a fact, folks. Dr. Bill McGraw talked about that last night on BitChute. In knowing his prejudices, I eventually read his book and found it well researched and thoroughly referenced. It demolishes the idea that people are having more heart attacks today because they are stuffing themselves with more animal fat than their ancestors did. On its surface, his thesis is contrary to what I was taught as well as to my own experience. So I obtained copies of many of the studies he quoted and read them over and over until they finally made sense in light of what I knew about electricity. Most important thing to keep in mind is that the early studies did not have the same outcome as research being done today, and that there is a reason for this difference. Even recent studies from different parts of the world do not always agree with each other for the same reason. Rabasco, however, has become something of an icon among portions of the alternative health community, including many environmental physicians who are now prescribing, quote, high-fat diets, emphasizing animal fats to their severely ill patients. They are misreading the medical literature. The studies that Rabasco relied on showed unequivocally that some factors other than diet is responsible for the modern scourge of heart diseases. But they also show that cutting down on dietary fat in today's world helps to prevent the damage caused by that other factor. Virtually every large study done since the 1950s in the industrial world, agreeing with what I was taught in medical school, has shown a direct correlation between cholesterol and heart disease. And every study comparing vegetarians to meat eaters has found that vegetarians today have both lower cholesterol levels and a reduced risk of dying from a heart attack. Rabasco speculated that this is because people who eat no meat are also more health conscious in other ways, but the same results have been found in people who are vegetarians only for religious reasons. Seventh-day Adventists all abstain from tobacco and alcohol, but only about half abstain from meat. A number of large long-term studies have shown that Adventists who are also vegetarians are 2 to 3 times less likely to die from heart disease. Perplexingly, the very early studies, those done in the first half of the 20th century, did not give these kinds of results and did not show that cholesterol was related to heart diseases. To most researchers, this has been an insoluble paradox, contradicting present ideas about diet, and has been a reason for the mainstream medical community to dismiss the early research. For example, people with the genetic trait called familial hypercholesterolemia, sorry I butchered that word, folks, have extremely high levels of cholesterol in their blood, so high that they sometimes have fatty growths on their joints and are prone to what they call gout-like attacks in toes and ankles and knees caused by cholesterol crystals. In today's world, these people are prone to dying young of coronary heart disease. However, this was not always so. Researchers at Leiden University in the Netherlands traced the ancestry of these 3 present-day individuals with this disorder until they found a pair of common ancestors who lived in the late 18th century. Then, by tracing all descendants of this pair and screening all living descendants for this defective gene, they were able to identify 412 individuals who either had definitely carried the gene and passed it on, or who were siblings who had 50% chance of carrying it. They found to their amazement that before the 1860s, people with this trait had a 50% lower mortality rate than the general population. In other words, cholesterol seemed to have had protective value, and people with very high cholesterol levels live longer than average. Their mortality rate, however, rose steadily during the late 19th century until it equaled the rate of the general population in about 1915. The mortality of this subgroup continued rising during the 20th century, reaching double the average during the 1950s and then leveling off somewhat. One can speculate, based on the study, that before the 1860s, cholesterol did not cause coronary heart disease, and there is other evidence that this is so. In 1965, Leon Michaels, working at the University of Manitoba, decided to see what historical documents revealed about fat consumption in previous centuries when coronary heart disease was extremely rare. What he found also contradicted current wisdom and convinced him that there must be something wrong with the cholesterol theory. One author in 1696 had calculated that the wealthy half of the English population, or about 2.7 million people, ate an amount of flesh yearly averaging 147.5 pounds per person, more than the national average for meat consumption in England in 1962. Nor did the consumption of animal fats decline at any time before the 20th century. Another calibration made in 1901 has shown that the servant-keeping class of England consumed on average a much larger amount of fat in 1900 than they did in 1950. Michaels did not think that lack of exercise could explain the modern epidemic of heart disease either, because it was among the idle upper classes who had never engaged in manual labor and who were eating much less fat than they used to that heart disease had increased the most. Then there was the incisive work of Jeremiah Morris, Morris, professor of social medicine at the University of London, who observed that in the first half of the 20th century, coronary heart disease had increased while coronary atheroma, that is cholesterol plaque in the coronary arteries, had actually decreased. Morris examined the autopsy records at London Hospital from the years from 1908 through 1949. In 1908, 30.4% of all autopsies in men aged 30 to 70 showed advanced atheroma. In 1949, only 16%. In women, the rate had fallen from 25.9% to 7.5%. In other words, cholesterol plaque in coronary arteries were far less common than before. But they were contributing to more disease, more angina, and more heart attacks. By 1961, when Morris presented a paper about the subject at Yale University Medical School, studies conducted in Birmingham, Massachusetts, and Albany, New York, had established a connection between cholesterol and heart disease. Morris was sure that some other unknown environmental factor was also important. Quote, "It is tolerably certain," end quote, he told his audience, quote, "that more than fats in the diet affect blood lipid levels. More than blood lipid levels are involved in atheroma formation, and more than atheroma is needed for ischemical heart disease," end quote. That factor, as we will see, is electricity. Electromagnetic fields have become so intense in our environment that we are unable to metabolize fats the way our ancestors could. Whatever environmental factor was affecting human beings in America during the 1930s and 1940s was also affecting all the animals in the Philadelphia Zoo. The Laboratory of Comparative Pathology was a unique facility founded at the zoo in 1901, and from 1916 to 1964, laboratory director Herbert Fox and his successor Herbert L. Radcliffe kept complete records of autopsies performed on over 13,000 animals that had died in the zoo. During this period, osteoporosis increased astounding 10 to 20-fold among all species of mammals and birds. In 1923, Fox had written that such lesions were extremely or exceedingly rare, end quote, occurring in less than 2% of animals as a minor and incidentally finding at autopsy. The incidence rose rapidly during the 1930s, and by the 1950s, osteoporosis was not only occurring in young animals, but was often the cause of their death rather than just a finding on autopsy. By 1964, disease occurred in 1/4 of all mammals and 35% of all birds. Coronary heart disease appeared even more suddenly. In fact, before 1945, disease did not exist in the zoo. And the first heart attacks ever recorded in zoo animals occurred 10 years later in 1955. Osteoporosis has been occurring with some regularity since the 1930s in the aorta and other arteries, but not in the coronary arteries of the heart. But cirrhosis of the coronary arteries now increased so rapidly among both mammals and birds that by 1963, over 90% of all mammals and 72% of all birds that died in the zoo had coronary disease. Wow. While 24% of the mammals and 10% of the birds had heart attacks, and the majority of the heart attacks were occurring in young animals in the first half of their expected lifespan. Osteoporosis and heart disease were now occurring in 45 families of mammals and 65 families of birds resting, or I should say residing, in the zoo. In deer and in antelope, in prairie dogs and squirrels, in lions and tigers and bears and in geese, storks and eagles. Diet has nothing to do with these changes. The increase in osteoporosis has begun well before 1935, the year that more nutritious diets were introduced throughout the zoo. Something is lurking and no one knows what's going on. That's my statement here. And coronary disease did not make its appearance until 10 years later, yet the animals' diets were the same at all times between 1935 and 64. The population density, for mammals at least, remained about the same during all 50 years as did the amount of exercise they got. Radcliffe tried to find the answer in social pressure brought about by breeding programs that were begun in 1940. He thought that psychological stresses must be affecting the animals' hearts, but he could not explain why. More than 2 decades later, coronary disease and heart attacks were continuing to increase, speculating throughout the zoo and among all species whether or not they were being bred. Nor could he explain why sclerosis of arteries outside the heart had increased during the 1930s, nor why thousands of miles away researchers were finding autosclerosis in 22% of the animals in the London Zoo in 1960, and a similar number in the Zoo of Antwerp, that is in Belgium, in 1962. The element that increased most spectacular in the environment during the 1950s, when coronary disease was exploding among humans and animals, was radio frequency, RF radiation. Before World War II, radio waves had been widely used for only 2 purposes: radio communication and diathermy, which is their therapeutic use in medicine to heat parts of the body. Suddenly, the demand for RF generating equipment was unquenchable. While the use of the telegraph in the Civil War had stimulated its commercial development, and the use of radio in World War I had done the same for that technology, the use of radar in World War II spawned scores of new industries. RF oscillators were being mass-produced for the first time, and hundreds of thousands of people were being exposed to radio waves on the job. You see radio waves that were now used not only in radar, but in navigation, in radio, and television broadcasting, radio astronomy, heating, sealing, and welding in dozens of industry and radar ranges, end quote, for the home. You remember those, what they call microwaves? Not only industrial workers, but the entire population was being exposed to unprecedented levels of RF radiation. For reasons having more to do with politics than science, history took opposite tracks on opposite sides of the world. In Western Bloc countries, science went deeply into denial. It had buried its head, ostrich-like, in the year 1800, as we saw in Chapter 4, and now simply piled on more sand. When radar technicians complained of headaches, fatigue, chest discomfort, and eye pain, and even sterility, that is being sterile, and hair loss, they were sent for a quick medical exam and some blood work. When nothing dramatically turned up, they were ordered back to work. The attitude of Charles I. Barron, B-A-R-R-O-N, medical director of the California division of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, was typical. Reports of illness from microwave radiation, quote, had all too often found their way into lay publications and newspapers, end quote. He said in 1955. He was addressing representatives of the medical profession, the armed forces, various academia institutions, and the airline industry at a meeting in Washington, D.C. Unquote, quote, unfortunately, end quote, he added, quote, the publication of this information within the past several years coincides with the development of our most powerful airborne radar transmitters, and considerable apprehension and misunderstanding has arisen among engineers and radar test personnel, end quote. And I'll tell you a little fact here real quick, or what I remember. I had someone in my family who got very sick, who worked at an airport with radar. And this now makes sense. It's starting to make sense. That's my gist on this, okay? That's not what's in this book, just what I'm sharing, what I'm revealing. And this was over probably 25 years ago, if not longer. He told his audience that he had examined hundreds of Lockheed employees and found no difference between the health of those exposed to radar and those not exposed. However, his study, which was subsequently published in the Journal of Aviation Medicine, was tainted by the same see no evil attitude. His, quote, unexposed, quote, end quote, control population was actually Lockheed workers who were exposed to radar intensity of less than 3.9 milliwatts per square centimeter, a level that is almost 4 times the legal limit for exposure of the general public in the United States today. 28% of those, quote, unexposed, end quote, employees suffer from neurological or cardiovascular disorders, or from jaundice, migraines, bleeding, anemia, or arthritis. And when Barron took repeated blood samples from his, quote, exposed, end quote, population, those who were exposed to more than 3.9 milliwatts per square centimeter, the majority had a significant drop in their red cell count over time and a significant increase in their white cell count. Barron dismissed these findings as, quote, laboratory errors, end quote. The Eastern Bloc experience was different. Workers' complaints were considerably important. Clinics dedicated entirely to the diagnosis and treatment of workers exposed to microwave radiation were established in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Warsaw, Prague, and other cities. Remember, these were countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc. So these would be the countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania. Those would be the prime areas, along with Russia. On average, about 15% of the workers in these industries became sick enough to seek medical treatment, and 2% became permanently disabled. The Soviets and their allies recognized that the symptoms caused by microwave radiation were the same as those first described in 1869 by American physician called George Beard. Therefore, using Beard's terminology, they called the symptoms called neuroasthenia, end quote. While the disease that caused them was named, quote, microwave sickness, end quote, or, quote, radio wave sickness, end quote. Intensive research began at the Institute of Labor, Hygiene, and Occupational Disease in Moscow in 1953. By the 1970s, the fruits of such investigation have produced thousands of publications. Medical textbooks on radio wave sickness were written, and the subject entered the curriculum of Russian and Eastern European medical schools. Today, Russia textbooks describe effect on the heart, nervous system, thyroid, adrenals, and other organs. Symptoms of radio wave exposure include headache, fatigue, weakness, dizziness, nausea, sleep disturbance, irritability, memory loss, emotional instability, depression, anxiety, sexual dysfunction, impaired appetite, abdominal pain, and digestive disturbances. Patients have visible tremors, cold hands and feet, flushed face, hyperactive reflexes, abundant perspiration, and brittle fingernails. Blood tests reveal disturbed carbohydrate metabolism and elevated triglycerides and cholesterol. Cardiac symptoms are prominent. They include heart palpitations, heaviness, and stabbing pains in the chest, and shortness of breath after exertion. The blood pressure and the pulse rate become unstable. Acute exposure usually causes rapid heartbeat and high blood pressure, while chronic exposure causes the opposite, meaning low blood pressure and a heartbeat that can be as slow as 35 to 40 beats per minute. The first heart sound is dull. The heart is enlarged on the left side, and a murmur is heard over the apex of the heart, often accompanied by premature beats and an irregular rhythm. Electrocardiogram may reveal a blockage of electrical conduction within the heart, and a condition known as left axis deviation. Signs of oxygen deprivation to the heart muscle, a flattening or inverted T wave, and depression of the ST interval are extremely frequent. Congested heart failure is sometimes the ultimate outcome. In one medical textbook published in 1971, the author Nikolai Tyagin stated that in his experience, only about 15% of workers exposed to radio waves had normal EKGs. All this knowledge has been completely ignored by the American Medical Association, no surprise, and is not taught in any American medical school, and has not gone unnoticed by some American researchers. This is why I'm reading this book, folks. Trained as a biologist, Alan H. Frey became interested in microwave research in 1960 by following his curiosity. Employed at the General Electric Company, that is an advanced electronics center at Cornell University, he was already exploring how electrostatic fields affect an animal nervous system, and he was experimenting with the biological effects of air ions. Late that year, while attending a conference, he met a technician from GE's radar test facility at Syracuse, who told Frey that he could hear radar. Quote, he was rather surprised, end quote. Frey later recalled, quote, when I asked if he would take me to a site and let me hear the radar, it seemed that I was the first person he had told about hearing radars who did not dismiss his statement out of hand, end quote. The man took Frey to his work site near the radar dome at Syracuse. Quote, and when I walked around there and climbed up to stand at the edge of the pulsating beam, I could hear it too. End quote. Frey remembers, quote, I could hear the radar going zip, 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 end quote. This chance meeting determined the future course of Frey's career. He left his job at General Electric and began doing full-time research into biological effects of microwave radiation. In 1961, he published his first paper on, quote, microwave hearing, end quote, a phenomenon that is now fully recognized, although still not fully explained. He spent the next 2 decades experimenting on animals to determine the effects of microwaves on behavior and to clarify their effects on the auditory system, the eyes, the brain, the nervous system, and the heart. He discovered the blood-brain barrier effect, an alarming damage to the protective shield that keeps bacteria, viruses, and toxic chemicals out of the brain. Damage that occurs at levels of radiation that are much lower than what is emitted by cell phones today. He proved that nerves, when firing, emit pulse of radiation themselves in the infrared spectrum. All of Frey's pioneering work was funded by the Office of Naval Research in the United States Army. When scientists in the Soviet Union began reporting that they could modify the rhythm of the heart at will with microwave radiation, Frey took a special interest. N.A. Levitin in Moscow had found that she could either speed up an animal's heart rate or slow it down, depending on which part of the animal's body she irradiating the back of an animal's head quickened its heart rate, while irradiating the back of its body or its stomach slowed it down. And Frey and his laboratory in Pennsylvania decided to take this research one step further. Based on the Russian results and his knowledge of physiology, he predicted that if he could use brief pulses of microwave radiation synchronized with the heartbeat and time to coincide precisely with the beginning of each beat, he would cause the heart to speed up and might disrupt its rhythm. It worked like magic. He first tried the experiment on the isolated hearts of 22 different frogs. The heart rate increased every time, and half the heart's rhythms occurred, and in some of the experiments, the heart stopped. The pulse of radiation was most damaging when it occurred exactly 1/5 of a second after the beginning of each beat. The average power density was only 0.6 of a microwave per square centimeter, roughly 10,000 times weaker than the radiation that a person's heart would absorb today if he or she kept a cell phone in a shirt pocket while making a call. So it's even, folks, this what he's showing something here. He's saying it simply is, it doesn't take a whole lot. Frey conducted the experiments with isolated hearts in 1967. 2 years later, he tried the same thing on 24 live frogs with similar though less dramatic results. No arrhythmias or cardiac arrest occurred, but when the pulses of radiation coincide with the beginning of each beat, the heart speeded up significantly. It's very disturbing what I'm reading right now, folks. This is really disturbing. As I read this, this is all, I read this earlier last year to myself online, and I actually have not read it since. So it's basically almost been a year ago. A friend told me about this book, and so I chose to read it. The effects Frey demonstrated occur because the heart is an electrical organ. It is. A microwave pulse interferes with the heart's pacemaker. But in addition to these direct effects, there is a more basic problem. Microwave radiation electricity in general starves the heart of oxygen because of effects at the cellular level. I can remember this. Let me just tell you something that happened at the hospital with my mom shortly before she passed away. I remember being in the room and they were quite concerned with my mom's heart. And it got me really concerned too. Naturally, I'm just, she's my mom. And her rhythm of her heart got out. And it scared the hell out of me. And I was praying fervently, because I knew that if this continued, this was not going to be good for my mom. So I could see what it could happen. They tried it a couple times, and eventually they got it back in rhythm. But it was nerve-wracking as I was standing there observing. The effects Frey demonstrates occurs because the heart is a electrical organ. And microwave pulses interfere with the heart's pacemaker. But in addition to these direct effects, there is a more basic problem. Microwave radiation electricity in general starves the heart of oxygen because of effects at the cellular level. These cellular effects were discovered, oddly enough, by a team that included Paul Dudley White in the 1940s and 1950s, while the Soviets were beginning to describe how radio waves cause neurasthenia in workers. The United States military was investigating the same disease in military recruits. The job that was assigned by Dr. Mandel Cohen and his associates in 1941 was to determine why so many soldiers fighting in the Second World War were reporting sick because of heart symptoms. Although their research spawned a number of shorter articles in medical journals, the main body of their work was a 150-page report that had been long forgotten. It was written for the Committee of Medical Research of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the office that was created by President Roosevelt to coordinate scientific and medical research related to the war effort. The only copy I located in the United States was on a single deteriorating roll of microfilm buried in the Pennsylvania storage facility of the National Library of Medicine. Wow. Unlike their predecessors since the time of Sigmund Freud, this medical team not only took their anxiety-like complaints seriously, but looked for and found physical abnormalities in the majority of these patients. They preferred to call the illness neurocirculatory asthenia, end quote, rather than neuroasthenia, end quote, or, quote, irritable heart, end quote, or, quote, effort syndrome, end quote, or anxiety neurosis, end quote, as it had variously been known since the 1860s. But the symptoms confronting them were the same as those first described by George Miller Beard in 1869. That is from chapter 5. Although the focus of this team was the heart, the 144 soldiers enrolled in that study also had respiratory, neurological, and muscular and digestive symptoms. Their average patient, in addition to having heart palpitations, chest pains, and shortness of breath, was nervous, irritable, shaky, weak, depressed, and exhausted. He could not concentrate, was losing weight, and was troubled by insomnia. That's been always a trait, folks, not being able to sleep. He complained of headaches, dizziness, and nausea, and sometimes suffered from diarrhea or vomiting. Yet standard laboratory tests, that is blood work, urine analysis, x-rays, electrocardiogram, and electroencephalogram were usually, quote, within normal limits. Well, what are those within normal limits? Okay, end quote. Cohen, who directed the research, brought to it an open mind. Raised in Alabama and educated at Yale, he was then a young professor at Harvard Medical School. He was already challenging deliberate wisdom and lighting one of the earliest sparks of what would eventually be a revolution in psychiatry. Where he had the courage to call Freudian psychiatry a cult back in the 1940s, when his practitioners were asserting control in every academic institution. He's right. Capturing the imagination of Hollywood and touching every aspect of American culture. Paul White was one of the two chief investigators. The other was neurologist Stanley Cobb, was already familiar with neurocirculatory asthenia from his civilian cardiological practice, and thought, and quote unquote, and though contrary to Freud, that it was a genuine physical disease. Under the leadership of these three individuals, the team confirmed that this was indeed the case. Using the techniques that were available in the 1940s, they accomplished what no one in the 19th century, when the epidemic began, had been able to do. They demonstrated conclusively that neurasthenia had a physical and not a psychological cause. And they gave the medical community a list of objective signs by which the illness could be diagnosed. Most patients had a rapid resting heart rate over 90 beats per minute, and a rapid respiratory rate, that is, in brackets, over 20 breaths per minute, as well as a tremor of the fingers and hyperactive knee and ankle reflexes. Most had cold hands, and half the patients had a visible flush face and neck. It has long been known that people with disorders of circulation have abnormal capillaries that can be most easily seen in the nail fold, the fold of skin at the base of the fingernails. White team routinely found such abnormal capillaries in their patients with neurocirculatory asthenia. They found that these patients were hypersensitive to heat, pain, and significantly to electricity. They reflectively pulled their hands away from electrical shocks at much lower intensity than did normal, healthy individuals. When asked to run on an inclined treadmill for 3 minutes, the majority of these patients could not do it. On average, they lasted only a minute and a half. The heart rate after such an exercise was excessively fast. The oxygen consumption during this exercise was abnormally low, and most significant, their ventilator efficiency was abnormally low. This means that they use less oxygen and exhale less carbon dioxide than a normal person, even when they breathe the same amount of air. To compensate, they breathed more air more rapidly than a healthy person, and was still not able to continue running because their bodies were still not using enough oxygen. A 15-minute walk on the same treadmill gave similar results. All subjects were able to complete this easier task. However, on average, the patients with neurocirculatory asthenia breathe 15% more air per minute than healthy volunteers in order to consume the same amount of oxygen. And although by breathing faster, the patients with neurocirculatory asthenia managed to consume the same amount of oxygen as the healthy volunteers, they had twice as much latent acid in their blood, indicating that their cells were not using that oxygen efficiently. Compared to healthy individuals, people with the disorder were able to extract less oxygen from the same amount of air, and their cells were able to extract less energy from the same amount of oxygen. The researchers concluded that these patients suffer from a defect of aerial metabolism. In other words, something was wrong with their mitochondria. It's a hard word for me to pronounce. Sorry about that. It's basically energy. It's what keeps your cells going. They're the powerhouses of the cells. As I learned from Dr. Bill McGraw, the patients correctly complained that they could not get enough air. In other words, they were starving all of their organs of oxygen, causing both their heart symptoms and their other disabling complaints. Patients with neurocirculatory asthenia were consequently unable to hold their breath for anything like a normal period of time, even when breathing oxygen. During the 5 years of Cohen's team studied, several types of treatments were attempted with different groups of patients: oral testosterone, massive doses of vitamin B complex, thiamine, cytochrome, psychotherapy, and course of physical training under a professional trainer. None of these programs produced any improvement in symptoms or endurance. That's kind of scary, isn't it? Quote, we conclude, end quote, wrote the team in June 1946. So they've known about this a long time ago, folks. That neurocirculatory asthenia is a condition that actually exists and has not been invented by patients or medical observers. It is not malignant or simply a mechanism aroused during wartime for purpose of evading military services. The disorder is quite common both as a civilian and as a service problem, end quote. They objected to Freud's term, quote, anxiety neurosis, end quote, because anxiety was obviously a result, of course, and not a cause of the profound physical effects of not being able to get enough air. In fact, these researchers virtually disproved the theory that the disease was caused by stress or anxiety, end quote. It was not caused by hyperventilation. This is 1949, folks. 1946. 1946. They knew this. Now, they did, not the government, of course. So that's 14 years over my age. So I'm 64. So you add that up, and that's 78 years ago. They knew about this 78 years ago. In fact, these researchers virtually disproved the theory that the disease was caused by stress or anxiety. I just said that. It was not caused by hyperventilation. These patients did not have elevated levels of stress hormone, what we call 17-ketosteroids, in their urine. A 20-year follow-up study of civilians with neurocirculatory asthenia revealed that these people typically did not develop any of the diseases that are supposed to be caused by anxiety, such as high blood pressure, peptic ulcer, asthma, or ulcerated colitis. However, they did have abnormal electrocardiograms that indicate that the heart muscle was being starved of oxygen, and that there was sometimes indistinguishably from the EKGs of people who had actual coronary artery disease or actual structural damage to the heart. The connection of electricity was provided by the Soviets. Soviet researchers during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s described physical signs and symptoms and EKG changes caused by radio waves that were identical to those that White and others had first reported in the 1930s and 1940s. The EKG changes indicate both conduction blocks and oxygen deprivation to the heart. The Soviet scientists, in agreement with Cohen and White's team, concluded that these patients were suffering from a defect of anaerobic metabolism. Something was wrong with the mitochondria in their cells, and they discovered what the defect was. Scientists that included, these are all looks like Russians because I can hardly pronounce their names, Yuri Tomanemsky, Mihail Shanadele, that's not correct, I'm sorry, and Ludmila Tomshkovskovya, working in Kiev, and F.A. Kolodov, N.P. Zayulbuskata, and R.I. Kasnalev, working in Krakow, which is in Poland, I think, proved that the activity of the electron transport chain mitochondrial, enzyme that extracted energy from our food is diminished not only in animals that are exposed to radio waves, but in animals exposed to magnetic fields from ordinary electric power lines. The first war in which the electric telegraph was widely used was the American Civil War. I can remember reading that. In fact, they would be the telegraph was used to report on battles that were taking place during the war. That was a very big deal. Was also the first in which, quote, irritable heart, end quote, was a prominent disease. A young physician named Jacob M. da Costa, visiting physician at a military hospital in Philadelphia, described a typical patient. Quote, a man who has been for some months or longer in active service, end quote, he wrote, quote, would be seized with diarrhea, that is diarrhea, anointing, yet not severe enough to keep him out of the field, or attacked with diarrhea or fever, he rejoined after a short stay in hospital. His command and again underwent the assertion. Sorry about that. Underwent the exertion of a soldier's life. He soon noticed that he could not bear them as formerly. He got out of breath, could not keep up with his comrades, was annoyed with dizziness and palpitation, and with pain in his chest. His accoutrements oppressed him, and all this though he appeared well and healthy. Seeking advice from the surgeon of the regiment, it was decided that he was unfit for duty, and he was sent to the hospital, where his persistently quick acting heart confirmed his story, though he looked like a man in sound condition, end quote. Exposure to electricity in this war was universal. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the East and West Coast had not yet been linked, and most of the country west of the Mississippi River was not yet served by any telegraph lines. That's correct. But in this war, every soldier, at least on the Union side, marched and camped near such lines. From the attack on Fort Sumter in April 12, 1861, until General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the United States Military Telegraph Corps, or we would call them now Signal Corps, rolled out 15.389 thousand miles of 15,389 miles of telegraph lines on the heels of the marching troops, so that military commanders in Washington could communicate instantly with all the troops at their encampments. After the war, all of these temporary lines were dismantled and dispersed of. Quote, hardly a day intervened when General Grant did not know the exact state of affairs or facts with me, more than 1,500 miles off as the wires ran, end quote, wrote General Sherman in 1864. Quote, on the field, a thin insulated wire may be run on improvised stakes or from tree to tree for 6 or more miles in a couple of hours, and I've seen operators so skillful that by cutting the wire, they would receive a message from a distant station with their tongues, end quote. Because the distinctive symptoms of irritable heart were encountered in every army of the United States and attracted the attention of so many in the medical office, Dr. da Costa was puzzled that no one had described such a disease in any previous war. But telegraphically, communications were never before used to such an extent in war. In the British Blue Book of the Crimean War, a conflict which lasted from 1953 to 56, da Costa found 2 references to some troops being admitted to hospitals for palpitations, end quote. And he found possibly hints of the same problem reported from India during the Indian Rebellion of 57 and 58, that is 1857 and 58. These were also the only 2 conflicts prior to the American Civil War in which some telegraph lines were erected to connect command headquarters with troop units. Da Costa wrote that he searched through medical documents from many previous conflicts and did not find even a hint of such disease prior to the Crimean War. During the next several decades, irritable heart attracted relatively little interest. It was reported, among British troops in India and in South Africa, and occasionally among soldiers of other nations. But the number of cases was small. Even during the Civil War, what Da Costa considered, quote, common, end quote, did not amount to many cases by today's standard. In his day, when heart disease was practically non-existent, the appearance of 1,200 cases of chest pain among 2 million young soldiers, caught his attention like an unfamiliar reef, suddenly materialized in a well-traveled shipping lane across a otherwise calm sea, a sea that was not further disturbed until 1914. But shortly after the First World War broke out, in a time when heart disease was still rare in the general population and cardiology did not even exist as a separate medical specialty, soldiers began reporting sick with chest pains and shortness of breath, not by the hundreds, but by the tens of thousands. Out of the 6.5 million young men that fought in the British Army and Navy, over 100,000 were discharged and pensioned with a diagnosis of, quote, heart disease, end quote. Most of these men had irritable heart, also called Da Costa syndrome, end quote, or effort syndrome, end quote. In the United States Army, such cases were all listed under valvular disorders of the heart, end quote, and were the third most common medical cause for discharge from the Army. The same disease also occurred in the Air Force, but was almost always diagnosed as, quote, flying sickness, end quote, though to be caused by repeated exposure to reduced oxygen pressure at high altitudes. Similar reports came from Germany, Austria, Italy, and France. So enormous was the problem that the United States Surgeon General ordered 4 million soldiers training in the Army camps to be given cardiac examination before being sent overseas. Effort syndrome was, quote, far away the most common disorder encountered and transcended in interest and importance of all the other heart affections combined, said one of the examined physicians, Louis A. Connor. Some soldiers in the war developed effort syndrome after shell shock or exposure to poison gas. But many more had no such history. All, however, had gone into battle using a newfangled form of communication. You see, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, 2 days after Germany invaded its ally, France. The British Army began embarking for France on August 9th, so that's 5 days later, and continued on to Belgium, reaching the city of Mons on August 27th without the aid of the wireless telegraph. But while in Mons, a 1,500-watt mobile radio set having a range of 60 to 80 miles was supplied to the British Army signal troops. It was during this retreat from Mons that many British soldiers first became ill with chest pains, shortness of breath, palpitations, and rapid heartbeat, and were sent back to England to be evaluated for possible heart disease. Exposure to radio was universal and intense. A knapsack radio with a range of 5 miles was used by the British Army in all trench warfare on the front lines. Every battalion carried 2 such sets, each having 2 operators in the front line with the infantry. 1 or 200 yards behind, back with the reserve, were 2 more sets and 2 more operators. A mile further back, at brigade headquarters was a larger radio set. 2 miles back at divisional headquarters was a 500-watt set. And 6 miles behind the front lines at Army headquarters was a 1,500-watt radio wagon with a 120-foot steel mast and an umbrella-type aerial. Each operator relayed the telegraph messages received from in front or behind him. All cavalry divisions and brigades were assigned with radio wagons and knapsack sets. Cavalry scouts carried special sets right on their horses that were called, quote, whisker wireless, end quote, because of their antenna that sprouted from the horses, flanked like the quills of a porcupine. Most aircraft carry a lightweight radio sets, using the metal frame of the airplane as the antenna. German war Zeppelins and French dirigibles carried much more powerful sets, and Japan had wireless sets in its war balloons. Radio sets on ships made it possible for naval battle lines to be spread out in formations of 200 or 300 miles long. Even submarines, while cruising below the surface, sent up short masts or an insulated jet of water as an antenna for the coded radio message they broadcast and received. In the Second World War, irritable heart, now caused what they call neurocirculatory asthenia, returned with a vengeance. Oh, somebody else, okay. Radar joined radio for the first time in this war, and it too was universal and intense. Like surely when a new toy, every nation devised as many uses for it as possible. Britain, for example, peppered its coastline with hundreds of early warning radar emitting more than 500,000 watts each, and outfitted all its airplanes with powerful radars that could detect objects as small as a submarine periscope. More than 2,000 portable radars, accompanied by 105-foot tall portable towers, were deployed by the British Army. 2,000 more, what they called, quote, gun laying, end quote, radars, assisted anti-aircraft guns in tracking and shooting down enemy aircrafts. The ships of the Royal Navy supported surface radars with a power of up to 1 million watts, as well as earth-air search radars and microwave radars that detected submarines and were used for navigation. The Americans deployed 500 early warning radars on board ships and additional early warning radars on aircraft, each having a power of 1 million watts. They used portable radar sets as beachheads and airfields in the South Pacific, and thousands of microwave radars on ships, aircrafts, and Navy blimps. From 1941 to 1945, the Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is called MIT, was kept busy by its military masters developing some 100 different types of radar for various uses in the war. The other powers, that is, fielded radar installation with equal vigor on land and sea and in air. Germany deployed over 1,000 ground-based early warning radars in Europe, as well as thousands of shipborne, airborne, and gun-laying radars. The Soviet Union did likewise, as did Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and Hungary. Wherever a soldier was asked to fight, he was bathed in an ever-thickening suit of pulse radar waves and microwave frequencies, and he succumbed in large number in the armies, navies, and air force of every nation. It was during this war that the first rigorous program of medical research was conducted on soldiers with this disease. By this time, Freud's proposed term, quote, anxiety neurosis, end quote, had taken firm hold among Army doctors. Members of the Air Force who had heart symptoms were now receiving a diagnosis of, quote, LMF, standing for lack of moral fiber, end quote. Cohen's team was stacked with psychiatrists, but to their surprise, and guided by the cardiologist Paul White, they found objective evidence of real disease that they concluded was not caused by anxiety. Largely because of the prestige of this team, research into neurocirculatory asthenia continued in the United States throughout the 1950s, in Sweden, Finland, Portugal, and France into the 1970s and 80s, and even in Israel and Italy into the 1990s. But a growing stigma was attached to any doctor who still believed in the physical causation of this disease. Although the dominance of the Freudian had waned, they left an indelible mark not only on psyche, but on all of medicine. Today in the West, only the, quote, anxiety, end quote, label remains, and people with the symptoms of neurocirculatory asthenia are automatically given a psychiatric diagnosis and very likely a paper bag to breathe into. Ironically, Freud himself, although he coined the term, quote, anxiety neurosis, end quote, thought that his symptoms were not mentally caused, quote, nor amenable to psychotherapy, end quote. Meanwhile, an unending stream of patients continued to appear in doctor's office suffering from unexplained exaltation, often accompanied by chest pain and shortness of breath, and a few courageous doctors stubbornly continued to insist that psychiatric problems could not explain them all. In 1988, the term, this is one that's very important, chronic fatigue syndrome, end quote, CFS, was coined by Gary Holmes at the Center for Disease Control, and it continues to be applied by some doctors to patients whose most prominent symptom is exaltation. Those doctors are still very much in the minority, based on their reports to CDC, has estimated the prevalence of CFS is between 0.2% and 2.5% of the population. While their counterparts in the psychiatric community tells us that as many as 1 person in 6 suffering from identical symptoms fits the criteria for anxiety disorder or depression, end quote. To confuse the matter still further, the same set of symptoms were called myalgic encephalomyelitis, sorry folks, ME, in England as early as 1956, a name that focused attention on muscle pains and neurological symptoms rather than fatigue. Finally, in 2011, doctors from 13 countries got together and adopted a set of, quote, international consensus criteria, end quote, that recommends abandoning the name, quote, chronic fatigue syndrome, end quote, and applying myalgic encephalomyelitis to all patients who suffer from, quote, post-exertion exhaustion, plus specific neurological, cardiovascular, respiratory, immune, gastrointestinal, and other impairments. This international consensus effort, however, is doomed to failure. It is completely ignores the psychiatric community, which sees far more of these patients, and it pretends that the schism that emerged from World War II never occurred. In the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and most of Asia, the older term neurasthenia, end quote, persists today. This term is still widely applied to the full spectrum of symptoms described as George Beard is in 1869. In those parts of the world, it is generally recognized as exposure to toxic agents, both chemical and electromagnetic, often causing this disease. According to published literature, all of these diseases, neurocirculatory asthenia, radio wave sickness, anxiety disorder, chronic fatigue syndrome, and myalgic encephalomyelitis, predispose to elevated levels of blood cholesterol, and all carries an increased risk of death from heart disease. So do porphyria and oxygen deprivation. The fundamental defect in this disease, of many names, is that although enough oxygen nutrients reach the cells, the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cells, cannot efficiently use that oxygen and those nutrients, and not enough energy is produced to satisfy the requirements of heart, brain, muscles, and organs. This effectively starves the entire body, including the heart, of oxygen and can eventually damage the heart. In addition, neither sugars nor fats are efficiently utilized by the cells, causing unutilized sugar to build up in the blood, leading to diabetes. This is the first time we've dealt with this, as well as unutilized fats to be deposited in arteries. And we have a good idea of precisely where the defect is located. People with this disease have reduced activity of porphyria-containing enzyme called cytochrome oxidase, which resides within the mitochondria, and delivers electrons from the food we eat to the oxygen we breathe. Its activity is impaired in all the incarnations of this disease. Mitochondria dysfunctions has been reported in chronic fatigue syndrome and in anxiety disorder. Muscle biopsies in these patients show reduced cytochrome oxidase activity, impaired glucose metabolism. It's well known in radio wave sickness, as it is impairment of cytochrome oxidase activity in animals exposed to even extremely low levels of radio waves. And the neurological and cardiac symptoms of porphyria are widely blamed on the deficits of cytochrome oxidase and cytochrome C, the HEME, containing enzymes of respiration. Let me check on something here, folks. Hold on just a second. Yeah, it's about 1 hour and 18 minutes. Okay, let's continue here. Might just see what I mean. Pages 11. I might stop here. I don't know. This is a lot longer chapter than I've done before. I think I'm going to do a couple more pages and we'll stop. efficiently utilized by the cells, causing unutilized sugar to be developed. So this is where the idea leading to diabetes and also well as unutilized fats to be deposited in arteries. And we have a good idea of precisely where the defect is located. People with this disease has reduced activity of porphyria containing enzyme called cytochrome oxidase, which resides within the mitochondria and delivers electrons from the food we eat to the oxygen we breathe. Its activity is impaired in all the incarnations of this disease. Mitochondrial dysfunction has been reported in chronic fatigue syndrome and in anxiety disorders. Muscle biopsies in these patients show reduced cytochrome oxidase activity. Impaired glucose metabolism is well known in radio wave sickness, as it is impairment of cytochrome oxidase activity in animals exposed to even extremely low levels of radio waves. And the neurological and cardiac symptoms of porphyria are widely blamed on deficiency of cytochrome oxidase and cytochrome C, the heme-containing enzyme of respiration. Recently, the zoologist Nilima Kumar at Punjab University in India proved elegantly that cellular respiration can be brought to a standstill in honeybee merely by exposing them to a cell phone for 10 minutes. The concentration of total carbohydrates in their hemolymph, which is what bees' blood is called, rose from 1.29 to 1.5 milligrams per milliliter. After 20 minutes, it rose to 1.73 milligrams per milliliter. The glucose content rose from 0.218 to 0.231 to 0.277 milligrams per milliliter. Total lipids rose from 2.06 to 3.03 to 4.5 milligrams per milliliter. Cholesterol rose from 0.230 to 1.381 to 2.565 milligrams per milliliter. Total protein rose from 0.475 to 0.525 to 0.825 milligrams per milliliter. In other words, after just 10 minutes of exposure to a cell phone, the bees practically could not metabolize sugar, proteins, or fats. Of course, we got a problem. We got a real problem. This is why people are sick. Mitochondria are essentially the same in bees and in humans, but since their metabolism is such much faster, electric fields affect bees much more quickly. In the 20th century, particularly after World War II, a barrage of toxic chemicals, electromagnetic fields, that is EMFs, began to significantly interfere with the breathing of our cells. We know from work at Columbia University that even tiny electric fields alter the speed of electron transport. From cytochrome oxidase, researchers Martin Blank and Reba Goodman thought the explanation laid in the most basic of physical principles, that is EMF, end quote. They wrote in 2009, quote, as acts as a force that competes with the chemical forces in a reaction, end quote. Scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency, that is John Alice and William Jonas, finding a similar effect from radio waves, developed a varied theory along the same lines. They speculate that the iron atoms in the porphyria containing enzymes were set into motion by the oscillating electric fields, interfering with their ability to transport electrons. It was the English physiologist John Scott Houghton, H-A-L-D-A-N, who first suggested in his classical book, Respiration, that, quote, soldier's heart, quote, end quote, was caused not by anxiety, but by a chronic lack of oxygen. Mandel Cohen later proved that the defect was not in the lungs, but in the cells. These patients continually gulped air, not because they were neurotic, but because they really could not get enough of it. You might as well have put them in an atmosphere that contained only 15% oxygen instead of 21%, or transported them to an altitude of 15,000 feet. These, that is, their chests hurt and their hearts beat fast, not because of panic, but because they craved air. And their hearts craved oxygen, not because their coronary arteries were blocked, but because their cells could not fully utilize the air they were breathing. These patients were not psychiatric cases. They were warnings for the world, for the same thing was also happening to the civilian population. They too were being slowly asphyxiated. And the pandemic of heart disease that was well underway in the 1950s was one result. Even in people who did not have propinia enzyme deficiency, the mitochondria in their cells were still struggling to some smaller degree to metabolize carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Unburned fats, together with the cholesterol that untransported, those fats in the blood, were being disposed on the walls of arteries. Humans and animals were not able to push their hearts quite as far as being before without showing signs of stress and disease. This takes its clearest toll on the body when it is pushed to the limits, for example, in athletes and in soldiers during war. The real story is told by astonishing statistics. When I began my research, I had only Samuel Milham's data, since he found such a large differences in real disease rates in 1940 between the five least and five most electrical states. I wanted to see what would happen if I calculated the rates for all 48 states and plotted the numbers on a graph. I looked up rural mortality rates and volumes of the vital statistics of the United States. I calculated the percentage of electrification for each state by dividing the number of its residential electric customers, as published by the Edison Electric Institute, by the total number of its households, as published by the U.S. Census. The results from 1931 and 1940 are pictured in Figure 1 and 2. Not only is there a 5 to 6-fold difference in mortality from rural heart disease between the most and least electrified states, but all the data points come very close to lying on the same line. The more a state was electrified, i.e., the more rural households had electricity. The more rural heart disease it had, the amount of rural heart disease was proportionate to the number of households that had electricity. And we're going to stop there because these are just simply graphs. I can see here he gives these things here of percentage, what we call electricity in 1931. And it's amazing that this graph is like a little half curve here. And I noticed that the state of South Carolina is really way down, which makes sense. And Mississippi is the bottom. That makes sense because these states that I'm talking about right now, I'm going to say them right quick here. They're the top five, the bottom five are this ones: New Mexico, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Those are the bottom five that basically got electrification the last. And that makes perfect sense. Since I live in South Carolina, I know that there are many rural parts, even in North Carolina, is up there. It's the next state. And Louisiana is the next one. And the next one is North Dakota and Tennessee. Most of the worst states were, guess where? The worst are Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey and Rhode Island, Connecticut, and looks like California and New Hampshire. All those states are in the Northeast except California. Okay, so that explains a lot, folks, right there. So you assume that basically the mortality rate would be much higher in those 5 states than it would be in the 5 lower ones because of that. And I'm not going to go into another graph here. It's kind of, I might do it next time, but it's already an hour and 15, 20 minutes I've done this talk. I will say something here, as it says here. Let's go. Let's just read this part here. What is even more remarkable is that the death rates from heart disease in unelectrified rural areas of the United States in 1931, before the rural electrification program got into gear, were still as low as the death rates for the whole United States prior to the beginning of the heart disease epidemic in the 19th century. In 1850, the first census year in which mortality data was collected, a total of 2,527 deaths from heart disease were recorded in the nation. Heart disease ranked 25th among causes of death in that year. About as many people died from accidentally drowning or as from heart disease. Heart disease was something that occurred mainly in young children and in old age, and was predominantly a rural rather than rural, as a rural area rather than an urban disease because farmers lived longer than city dwellers. In order to realistically compare 1960 statistics with those of today, I had to make some adjustments to the census figures. The census enumerations from 1850 to 1860 and 1870 had only the numbers reported to them from memory by the households they visited as to who had died during the previous year and from what causes. So this is just based upon that. These members were estimated by the census office to be deficient on average by about 40%. That's pretty heavy, isn't it? In the census for 1880, the numbers were supplementally by reports from physicians and averaged only 19% short of the truth. By 1890, 8 northeastern states plus the District of Columbia had passed laws requiring the official registration of all deaths, and the statistics for these registration states were considered accurate to within 2 to 3%. By 1910, the registration area had expanded to 23 states. By 1930, only Texas did not require registration of deaths. Another complicating factor is that heart failure was sometimes not evident except for the edema is caused, and therefore edema, then called dropsy, was sometimes reported as the only cause of death, although the death was most likely to have been caused by either heart or kidney disease. Yet a further complication in the appearance of, quote, blight disease, end quote, for the first time in the tables of 1870. This was a new term for the type of kidney disease that caused edema. Its prevalence in the 1870s was reported to 4.5 cases per 100,000 people. With this complexity in mind, I have calculated the approximate rates of death for cardiovascular disease for each decade from 1850 to 2010, adding the figures for dropsy when that term was still in use until 1900, and subtracting 4.5 per 100,000 for the year 1850 and 1860. I added a correction factor of 40% from 1850, 1860, 1870, and 19% in 1880. I included reports of deaths from all diseases of the heart, arteries, and blood pressure. Beginning with 1890, I used only the figures for the death registration states, which by 1930 included the entire country except Texas. So here's the deal here. It's interesting. Death rates from cardiovascular disease per 100,000 population. In 1850, it was only 77 people would die out of 100,000 people. 1860, 78. 1870, 78. Then there's a turn. In 1880, 102. In 1890, 145. Then they have a calculation here, also 1890, of the Indians on reservations, which was far less natural because there was no electricity there. There was only 60. That rate continues on, so we continue on. It won't be about Indians. This is again back to the race here. So it became 154 in 1900. 1910, 183. 1928, 187. 1930, 235. 1941, 291. Almost 100 many people died. 1950 from 384. 1960, 396. Seems to actually get its peak here, which was 396 in 1960. 1970 was 394, and then it started dropping. 361 in 1980, 310, 1990, 2000, 280, 210 in 2010, and in 2017 his last one was 214. So 1910 was the first year in which the mortality in cities surpassed that in the countryside. But the greatest disparity emerged in the countryside, in the northeastern states, which in 1910 had the greatest use of telegraphs, telephones, and now electric lights and power, and the densest network of wires crisscrossing the land. The rural areas had as much mortality from cardiovascular disease or more than the cities. The rural mortality rate of Connecticut was then 234, of New York 279, and Massachusetts 296. By contrast, Colorado's rural rate was still 100, and Washington 92. Kentucky's rural rate was at 88.5, was only 44% of the urban rate, which was 202. Yeah, a few more pages and we'll stop. Okay. Heart disease rose steadily with electrification, as we saw in figures 1 and 2, and reached a peak when rural electrification approached 100% during the 1950s. Rates of heart disease then leveled off for 3 decades and began to drop again, and so it seemed at first glance. A close look, however, shows the true picture. These are just the mortality rates. The number of people walking around with heart disease, the prevalence rate, actually continued to rise and is still rising today. So mortality stopped rising in the 1950 because of the introduction of anticoagulants like heparin and later aspirin, both to treat heart attacks and to prevent them. In the succeeding decades, the even more aggressive use of anticoagulants, drugs to lower blood pressure, cardiac bypass surgery, and balloon angioplasty, and coronary stents and pacemakers, and even heart transplants has simply allowed an ever-growing number of people with heart disease to stay alive. But people are not having fewer heart attacks, you see. They are having more. The Framingham Heart Study showed that in a given age, the chance of having the first heart attack is essentially the same during the 1990s as it was during the 1960s. This came as something of a surprise by giving people statin drugs to lower their cholesterol. Doctors thought they were going to save people from having clogged arteries, which was supposed to automatically mean healthier hearts. It hasn't turned out that way, folks. And in another study, scientists involved in the Minnesota Heart Survey discovered in 2001 that although fewer hospital patients were being diagnosed with coronary heart disease, more patients were being diagnosed with heart-related chest pain. In fact, between 1985 and 1995, the rate of unstable angina had increased by 56% in men and by 30% in women. The number of people with congested heart failure had also continued steadily to rise. Researchers at Mayo Clinic searched 2 decades of their records and discovered that the incidence of heart failure was 8.3% higher during the period of 1996 to 2000 than it had been during the 1979 and 1984. So it hasn't gotten any better. The true situation is much worse, though. Those numbers reflect only people newly diagnosed with heart failure. The increase in the total number of people walking around with this condition is astonishing, and only a small part of the increase is due to the aging of the population. Doctors from Cook County Hospital, Loyola University Medical School, and the Centers for Disease Control examined patient records from a representative sample of American hospitals and found that the numbers of patients with a diagnosis of heart failure more than doubled between 1973 and 1986. A later similar study by scientists at the Center for Disease Control found that this trend had continued. So the number of hospitalizations for heart failure tripled between 1979 and 2004. The age-adjusted rate doubled, and the greatest increase occurred in people under 65 years of age. A similar study of patients at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit showed that the annual prevalence of congested heart failure had almost quadrupled from 1989 to 1999. That's 10 years. Young people, as the 3,000 alarmed doctors who signed the Firstenberg appeal affirm, are having heart attacks at an unprecedented rate in the United States, as greater percentage of 40-year-olds today have cardiovascular disease at the percentage of 70-year-olds that had cardiovascular disease in 1970. You see, this is all becoming a major problem, folks. It's a big-time problem. And it's been covered up for hundreds of years. Close to 1/4 of Americans aged 40 to 44 today have some form of cardiovascular disease, and the stress of even younger hearts is not confined to athletes. In 2005, researchers at the Center for Disease Control surveying the health and adolescents and young adults, even aged 15 to 34, found to their surprise that between 1989 and 1998, rates of sudden cardiac death in young men had risen 11%, and in young women had risen 30%. And that rate of mortality from enlarged heart rhythm disturbances, pulmonary heart disease, and hypertensive heart disease had also increased in this young people. We're not getting any better here, folks. You may be living longer, but we're not getting any better. In the 21st century, this trend has continued. The number of heart attacks in America in their 20s now, rose by 20% between 1999 and 2006. And the mortality from all types of heart disease in that age group rose by 1/3. In 2014, which is basically the last year he has here, which is now almost, it is 10 years low, among patients between the age of 35 and 74 who were hospitalized with heart attacks, 1/3 were below the age of 54. Developing countries are no better off. They have already followed the developing countries down the primrose path of electrification, and they are following us even faster to the wholesale embrace of wireless technology. That's correct, folks. It's far worse in Africa. You'll find that almost all Africans now have cell phones, immensely, even 10 or 15 years ago. The consequences are inevitable. The heart disease was once unimportant in low-income nations. It is now the #1 killer of human beings in every region of the world except one. That being sub-Saharan Africa. In 2017 was heart disease still outranked by diseases of poverty, that is AIDS and pneumonia, as a cause of mortality. In spite of the billions being spent on conquering heart disease, the medical community is still groping in the dark. Of course they are. It will not win this war so long as it fails to recognize that the main factor that has been causing this pandemic for 150 years is the electrification of the world. So that is it. That's chapter 11. I think it was tonight. Appreciate you listening. Much longer than I anticipated, but we got through it. I wish that people would actually read this book and find out for sure what is going on. So it's really sad what's going on, and most people are unaware of it, have no idea what's going on. In fact, everything seems to be, in their minds, normal, but it's not. So we're going to stop here at actually an hour and 41 minutes. Wow. Okay, we're going to stop. Have a good evening. Chapter 11 was what deals with irritable heart by author Firstenberg, I should say. Thank you for being here.